The crowd had gathered like they always did, laughing, jeering, clutching whiskey and cigar smoke as if cruelty were entertainment. But this time it wasn't cattle or tools or stolen horses up on that cracked wooden platform. It was a girl no older than 8, thin as wire, legs twisted from some fever long past, hair tangled and eyes wide with the terror of being bartered like livestock, and not a soul in the dusty town of Grayson looked ready to stop it. Until the cowboy stepped out of the shadows, his face half covered by an old burn scar that split down from his eye to his throat, silent as a ghost, but heavier than thunder, boots pounding the earth like they meant something righteous. And when he walked up to the stage without saying a word, just locking eyes with the auctioneer, the whole saloon porch fell still, because everyone remembered that face from the war, the fire, and the day half the town watched him walk through gunfire like it was rain. So when he reached into his coat and pulled out not a pistol, but a single silver coin, the bidding stopped cold. And when he set it down beside the girl and lifted her up like she weighed nothing at all, folks realized this wasn't about money or mercy, but a promise being kept to someone long gone. And the girl, who'd never known softness in a touch, wrapped her arms around his neck without asking his name, just cried into his burned collar while he carried her into the storm brewing past the chapel road. And that was the moment Grayson knew. Whatever sins it thought it could hide in plain sight had just been challenged by a ghost who came back not for revenge, but redemption. The storm broke before they made it past the ridge, wind lashing like it was sent to test his resolve. But the girl clung to him with a quiet fierceness that told him she'd survived worse than rain. And he didn't ask her name yet. Names came after safety. So he rode hard through the gulch, past the old sycamore where his brother had bled out 10 years back, up to the shack he hadn't unlocked in half a decade, not since he swore off people and promises alike. But tonight was different, because as he laid her on the cot and peeled off her soaked boots, revealing the crooked angles of her feet and ankles, he saw scars that weren't from fever. They were from shackles, tight ones, and burns along her wrist that said someone wanted her punished just for breathing. And that's when she spoke for the first time. Voice hoarse but clear. He said I wasn't worth feeding no more. And something in him snapped, not loud or violent, but deep, like a bone breaking where it had healed wrong. So he stood, jaw locked, staring into the fire he'd built, not to warm himself, but to burn away the ghosts that followed him home. And he said only one thing. Ain't no man decides your worth, not while I'm still breathing. And though she didn't smile, her eyes flickered with something close to belief, just for a second, before exhaustion took her, and he sat beside her the rest of the night, revolver on his knee, because he knew Grayson's worst wouldn't let go easy. Not of the girl, and not of the man who'd shamed them in front of their own whiskey-stinking pride. By morning, Grayson had already begun to boil. Word traveled faster than reason in a town like that, and the men who'd placed bets on the crippled girl's fate were now sitting in the sheriff's back room, spitting tobacco and demanding restitution, muttering about property and spectacle and how a scar-faced hermit had embarrassed them all, but none of them dared ride out just yet. Not without the sheriff's nod, and Sheriff Mace was a man who measured everything in dollars and blood. And he remembered that cowboy well, Eli Cutter, the one they left for dead in the South Canyon fire after the Doll Ridge raid, the one who came back with a face melted like wax and a heart colder than the grave. But now he'd stepped into their dirty little system and pulled the rug out. And Mace didn't like loose threads, so he sent a rider to the preacher's wife, told her to ask questions around town, then called in Clay Haskins, a bounty man with no scruples and a personal hatred for Eli going back to when Eli broke his jaw in a saloon for slapping a waitress. And meanwhile, up in the shack, Eli was spooning broth into the girl's mouth and trying not to wince every time she flinched, because healing came slow to someone who'd never been allowed to be weak. And when he asked her name, she said, Junie then asked if she could stay if she swept the floor and didn't eat too much, and Eli nearly laughed, but it caught in his throat like ash, and he just said, "Ain't nobody here got rules but me, and mine say you stay as long as you want." And that's when Junie looked at him different, like he wasn't just a man with scars, but a man who meant what he said. And neither of them knew that 3 riders were already headed their way. One with a rope, one with a shotgun, and one with a badge that had rusted around the edges from misuse. The first rider came just past noon, trotting slow like he was delivering mail, not malice, but Eli knew better. He recognized Clay Haskins by the way he leaned in his saddle, cocky and crooked, like a man who'd never paid for his sins. And Eli stepped out before Clay could dismount, stood square in the yard with his shirt sleeves rolled and his pistol holstered but close, eyes locked and waiting, and Clay grinned wide, yellow teeth flashing like warning signs, and said, "Heard you been collecting broken things again, Eli. Figured I'd come fetch what ain't yours." But Eli didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared long enough for Clay to get uneasy, then finally said, "She ain't a thing." And the words hit harder than any bullet, because Clay's grin twitched, turned bitter, and he nodded once like he'd expected as much, then added, "Well, sheriff's given me cause to reclaim her. Town says she was purchased, fair and legal." And Eli stepped forward then, just enough for Clay's hand to twitch near his hip, and replied, "Then tell your town I don't trade in what was stolen." And before Clay could reach for iron, Junie stepped onto the porch, her small frame wrapped in Eli's old coat, eyes fierce despite her limp, and said, "I ain't goin'," and something about the way she stood behind Eli, like she trusted him with her life, shook Clay more than any weapon, so he spat in the dirt and turned his horse, but not before muttering, "Next time, I ain't comin' alone." And Eli knew he meant it, which was why he spent the next hour reinforcing the windows, oiling the hinges on the hidden trap door beneath the stove, and digging up the tin box in the barn that held the last piece of the man he used to be. A badge, scorched black, and a promise carved in bone. Protect what's right, even if you're the last man standin'. They came 2 nights later, not by daylight like decent men might, but slinking through juniper shadows with lanterns hooded and rifles primed. 6 of them this time. Clay at the front, Mace's nephew among them, and 2 ranch hands Eli once helped dig out of a flood, but who now rode for gold instead of gratitude. And inside the shack, Junie barely breathed as Eli knelt by the window, rifle across his knee, watching the trail for the flicker of movement that always gave away men who thought they were hunters. And he didn't speak much, just whispered, "You remember the crawl space I showed you?" And Junie nodded, lip trembling but eyes steady. And when he handed her the small pouch of jerky and the tin flask, she didn't ask why, she knew. But before she ducked down beneath the stove, she did something that made him pause. She pressed her tiny hand against his burnt cheek and said, "You ain't a ghost to me." And those 6 words hit harder than the gunshot that shattered the front window. A heartbeat later, glass flying like snow, and Eli rolled instinctively, firing back without aim but enough to scatter them. And what followed was a kind of storm, not made of weather but fury. Bullets tearing through wood and dirt alike as Eli moved like he had during the worst of the war. Calm, quick, silent, dropping one man with a shot through the thigh, another with a cracked jaw from the butt of his rifle, until only Clay and the sheriff's kin remained, holed up behind the wagon out front, shouting that they had a warrant and the girl was town property. And Eli, crouched behind his well, shouted back, "Then bring the whole damn town!" And when a shot rang out in response, it hit the old sign hanging above the shack. Cutter Ranch. All are safe here, and Eli saw it fall, shattered like the peace he'd once known. And something inside him rose up, not rage, but a kind of sacred duty. And he stood, fully visible, daring them to try and claim what wasn't theirs, because this wasn't just about a girl anymore. It was about every soul the town had trampled while no one stood up. The boy, Mace's nephew, was the first to lose nerve, backing his horse into the brush with shaking hands, muttering about how it wasn't supposed to be a war, and Clay, furious and cornered, spat curses after him, but knew better than to stand alone. So when he finally turned tail, wounded pride dripping from his saddle like sweat, Eli didn't pursue. He simply stood there in the moonlight, rifle lowered, chest heaving, listening to the sound of hooves fading into the hills and the eerie calm that came after cowards failed to finish what they started. But it wasn't over. Not even close. And he knew it as he stepped back inside, locking the door behind him and dropping to one knee beside the stove, lifting it just enough to see Junie curled tight beneath the floorboards, eyes wide, fists clenched around the coat like a lifeline, and when she saw him, she whispered, "Are you hurt?" Not with fear, but with worry so pure it near broke him, and he laughed low and said, "Takes more'n that to ruin me." But he could feel the bruise blooming along his ribs where the wagon splinter had hit, and when he helped her up, she didn't limp like before. She ran to him and held him hard, and for a long minute they stayed there in silence until she said, "They'll come back." And he nodded because she was right, and then she added, "But I'll fight too," and those words hit him with a weight he hadn't known he still carried, because in her he saw a flicker of the sister he lost, the one the raiders took while he fought fires miles away, and maybe that's why he stepped outside after she fell asleep, stood under the stars, and whispered the name Rebecca, like maybe she could hear him and forgive him for failing her, because this time he wouldn't fail. Not this girl, not again, and not while there was breath left in his lungs and bullets in his belt, even if it meant burning down the lies Grayson built itself on just to keep one little soul safe. By dawn, Eli had made a decision that surprised even himself. He saddled up the mule cart, not his horse, loaded it with supplies, and wrapped Junie in a quilt like she was cargo too precious for the saddle's jostle, because running was cowardice if it meant leaving others behind, but sometimes retreat was the only way to fight smarter, and Eli knew Grayson wasn't the kind of town that let grudges cool. It sharpened them. So he headed west toward Copper Bend, a place that once turned him away for the shape of his face, but where now lived a widow named Etta Cole, who owed him a life and maybe a favor. And as the trail bent past the rocky gulch, Eli kept his rifle close and his ears open, because ambushes weren't just for bandits anymore. They were for men with titles and ink-stained warrants, too, and somewhere near Dust Hollow, Junie stirred awake and asked if she was heavy, and Eli chuckled, said, "You weigh about as much as a feather dreamin' of being a rock," which made her smile in that way that cracked him wide open. And then she asked the question he'd been bracing for. "Why do they want me back?" And Eli didn't lie. He never had time for lies. So he said, "'Cause they think broken things don't talk back." And she stared at the horizon like she wanted to prove that wrong. And just then a hawk cried overhead, circling wide, and Eli tensed, eyes scanning the ridge, because birds always knew when men were near. And sure enough, 2 riders appeared in the far dust. One he recognized as Mace himself, the other a stranger dressed too fine for trail work, which meant money had entered the game now, and money made men desperate. So Eli flicked the reins and said, "Hold on," and the cart lurched forward fast, racing toward Copper Bend as thunderheads rolled low in the sky, and behind them, the sound of hooves began to build, not like a chase yet, but like a promise waiting to be claimed. The rain caught them a mile outside Copper Bend, sudden and vicious, turning dust to mud and slowing the mule to a crawl. But Eli didn't stop. He could see the church spire through the downpour, knew that once they crossed into town, Mace would need more than muscle to take her back. But just as they reached the edge of the valley, a shot cracked through the storm, sharp and hungry, grazing the wheel rim and sending Junie tumbling sideways, caught only by Eli's quick arm. And when he looked back, Mace and the stranger were no longer following from a distance. They were charging now, reckless and close. And that's when Eli made a choice no man makes easy. He pulled up the cart by Etta Cole's pasture fence, grabbed Junie in both arms, and ran through the gate like the devil chased him, calling out her name louder than he'd spoken in years, and the door flew open fast. There she stood, older now but just as sharp-eyed, and without a word she ushered them in, slammed the bolt, and pulled a shotgun from the wall like it had never gathered dust. And when Junie looked at her, Etta winked and said, "Don't worry, child. I ain't fond of uninvited guests." And outside, hooves skidded to a halt as Mace dismounted, yelling that the girl was county property, claiming law where there was none. But Etta stepped onto her porch, shotgun aimed steady, and said, "You'll get to her when you get through me, and I still remember how to aim for knees." And inside, Eli sat by the fire, clutching Junie tight as she trembled not from fear, but from the cold sting of near death. And for the first time, he whispered something meant not for her ears, but his own healing. "You're mine now, and I ain't letting you go." Because it wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was blood deep now, heart sworn. And as the rain poured down and Mace finally turned away, seething but outgunned, Eli realized he hadn't run from Grayson after all. He'd run toward something worth staying for. By the next evening, word had already reached Copper Bend. Grayson's sheriff had been humiliated at gunpoint by a scarred ghost, and a woman with one good eye and a memory like iron. And while Mace licked his wounds back east, the stranger who'd ridden with him, a banker's envoy named Herrick, wasn't done yet. He'd stayed behind, offering gold in whispers and legal threats in louder tones. And that's how the mayor of Copper Bend, a man with soft hands and a reputation for folding quick, found himself handing over forged papers claiming custody of Junie to settle the dispute before it turned into a frontier scandal. But Herrick didn't know Eli had seen his kind before, men who used ink like knives and laws like bullets. And when the mayor knocked on Etta's door with trembling excuses and a guilty conscience, Eli didn't argue or raise his voice. He just took the papers, read every word in silence, then folded them once, dropped them into the fire, and said, "If he wants her, he'll have to come take her, again." And behind him, Junie stepped out, holding Eli's revolver in both hands, arms shaking but face like flint, and said, "He's not taking me nowhere." And Etta, watching from the rocker, let out a low chuckle and muttered, "Well, hell, she's a cutter now, sure as sun." And when the mayor left pale-faced and near tears, Herrick came himself, flanked by 2 hired guns, demanding the girl, threatening trials and jail and ruin. But Eli just walked out with his burn-scarred face and blood-soaked history and said, "You ever wonder what it feels like to lose everything over one lie?" And Herrick, confused, didn't answer in time before Eli added, "You're about to find out." And with one swift move, he threw open the stable, revealing Mace's wounded nephew, tied gently but securely, rescued hours earlier from the edge of town after a bounty crew left him for dead over unpaid debts. And the boy, weak but conscious, looked at Herrick and whispered, "He saved me. Don't hurt the girl." And with that, the banker's case crumbled in the court of every onlooker's heart, and Herrick fled town as fast as his horse could carry him, leaving Eli, Junie, and Etta alone in the warm hush of justice earned. Not forced. Spring came slow to Copper Bend, but when it did, it painted the hills green and the fences bright. And out at Etta's place, now called Cutter's Rise by the children who played near it, Junie ran through the grass with a slight limp, and a laugh loud enough to shame thunder, her legs still crooked but stronger, steadier, made resilient not by healing but by love that never questioned her worth. And Eli, who once lived in silence so thick it felt like death, now rose each morning with purpose, tending the garden, teaching Junie to shoot tin cans from fence posts, and sometimes sitting with Etta in the long orange evenings, sharing stories they once swore they'd never speak again. And though Grayson never sent men again, not after Herrick's shame and Mace's quiet resignation, rumors traveled that the town had started cleaning its filth, fearing more men like Eli might rise from the dust. And one day, Junie came running in with a wounded bird in her hands and said, "He's got a bad wing, but I think he'll fly again." And Eli just smiled and nodded, because he knew she wasn't talking about the bird. Not really. And that night, as stars scattered across the dark like scattered prayers, Junie asked, "Did I change your life?" And Eli knelt, looked her straight in those wide eyes, and said, "You didn't change it, Junie. You gave it back." And the girl, no longer a trembling shadow from the auction block, wrapped her arms around the man with the scarred face and the iron heart, and whispered, "Then I'm glad you came for me." And he answered soft, "No, darlin', you came for me, because some saves don't come with bullets or blood, but with a child's trust and a second chance, and the wind that night carried not pain, but peace, across the prairie like a hymn too long unsung. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Western Ember. If you had seen her there, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.